So earlier this week, we saw a ban list, and we weren't too excited about the prospect of that ban list also being applied to the English variant. Luckily though, Bushrod immediately announced that we would get a new ban list on a later date for the English format, which gave us hope. And now that ban list is here, and let's see if that hope was false or actually true. Stand up! Vanguard! Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another video, and today we finally have the brand new Spring Banlist for Vanguard. And yes, there's actually a different list for the English version than we saw for the Japanese version. Because for anybody that hasn't seen the Japanese version left some things to be desired, and we were kind of scared about the prospect of what the next coming 3 to 6 months are going to be for V Premium. So, without any further ado, let's jump straight into the restrictions and see what the next coming months for Vanguard is going to look like with these new bans in place. So, first off, they showed us this image, which is basically the exact same image that we saw for the Japanese version. So, what we can see here is that Standard is going to get no restriction. Premium is going to get no restrictions. But for V Premium, we see that Hamiya is going to be banned. Meep is going to be restricted to 1. The choice restriction between Percival and Gurgit is going to be lifted, so you cannot play Percival and Gurgit again. But Percival is also going to be restricted to 1 copy for the entire clan. So Gold Paladin can only use 1 copy, whatever archetype you're going to be playing with the clan. This we already knew, but let's go over these restrictions for anybody that isn't aware what the implications here are, because I haven't discussed this on the channel previously. So for Standard, this doesn't really mean all too much, because Standard right now is, in my opinion, and this is a sentiment shared with a lot of community members, is that Standard is in a very good position from set 4 moving forward. So they probably don't need anything to be hit. Now, as for Premium, yes, Premium is in a relatively good state ever since the last ban list, but there were some talk about potentially banning or limiting Ginny for the Nightmare Doll deck to rein in the power level of this deck. Sadly, we're not seeing that here. Also, Overtriggers aren't banned, which some people were hoping with the fact that English is going to get a separate ban list. Again, we're not seeing that here. It is going to be too much of an issue. I don't think it's too big of a problem right now, but we have to wait and see until the result for the upcoming Spring Fest to see if Premium needs yet another restriction, if Nightmare Dolls is too much of a hassle right now, but it's too early to say right now. So I think this is completely fine. Now, as for the V Premium restrictions, Hamiya being banned basically means the deck is gone. Like, the Gavriel deck is no longer the cheese factor it was. Now, will Gavriel be unplayable? I don't necessarily think so, because the rescue check itself is still a powerful mechanic. They don't have an immediate win condition, but to be fair, this was, in my opinion, an unfair win condition. They do have a backup plan in the form of Hospital, but is that a good replacement? I don't really believe so, because Hospital is a lot slower, which also makes it a more fair win condition. And there isn't really a good way to accelerate Great Freezing your soul in the Gavriel archetype, because Hamiya was one of those ways, because the card went towards the soul. Now that also isn't a factor anymore. So I think Gavriel is probably going to fall off quite a bit. Maybe it will come back with the Hospital variant, but I'm very skeptical on that part. Now, as for Meep, Meep is basically the consistency engine for the Melody deck, and the Melody deck is one of those high roll decks that can just win out of nowhere, and it was not really on a lot of players' radar, but besides Prison, this was basically the next best thing. And being restricted to 1 is probably the best thing here, because this is the only generic, within the archetype of course, consistency engine. Because for Melody, this was essentially a 3+2. You soul plus 1 in most cases, which isn't an issue, and then you can grab 2 Melody cards from top 7, and you're probably always going to see that, because you see a lot of, you play a lot of Melody cards, and one is going towards the soul, and one is going to go towards your hand, and the one goes towards the soul is basically also plus for the engine, because it works with the soul with copying all the skills. So hitting this to 1 decrease the consistency of the deck quite significantly, but I don't know if it's enough, because I played against Melody a couple of times, and in my games they hardly used the card and still popped off like crazy. So we have to wait and see if this is enough, and if it isn't, I think the next best thing to hit is probably the Great Free Cannon, which allows you to soul charge like your entire deck, because that is the next best consistency engine for the archetype, because that allows you to high roll out of nowhere, because that's the way to fill your soul with all the cards you're going to need to steamroll your opponent. Now, as for Gold Paladin, I'm kind of sad about the fact that they restrict Percival in general, because that means the Bluish Flame deck itself is somewhat unplayable right now. And it wasn't that strong to begin with, but now it's just outright unplayable. So that deck just killed the deck offward with this restriction. But on the other side, they also limit every Gold Paladin deck's power level quite significantly, because Percival was probably one of the strongest cards in the clan. And Gurgrid being now able to play one copy makes Gurgrid a little bit stronger. I don't think it's going to be strong enough to be the best variant of Gold Paladin, but at the very least you can play the deck again. And the number one deck for Gold Paladin at the moment was Spectral Duke. And Spectral Duke losing 3 Percivals does hit the deck quite significantly, but I'm honestly not convinced that the deck is falling off completely, because the deck with its own engine, the own Spectral Duke engine, is in itself all strong enough. And playing one copy of Percival could be just enough to tip the scale in its favor to make the deck still a very strong meta contender. Now, that's pure speculation, because nobody has playtested the deck with only one Percival, so we don't know the actual outcome of it, but I wouldn't write the deck off just yet. So, with the restrictions we see here, basically we can make that Gavriel is gone. Melody is probably still playable, but less consistent, and Spectral Duke is probably less explosive, but can still win games because Spectral Duke himself has that much power built into the card. The thing is, if we looked at this restriction, we would see that the number 1 and 2 deck are still untouched, because the number 1 and 2 deck in the V Premium format are Luard and Prisms. And what they just did is they hit the number 3, 4, and 5 decks, which means you make the number 1 and 2 deck even that much stronger, because they have even less competition to worry about. Luckily, Bouchero did recognize this, at least for the English format, and rectify this a little bit, because they added some extra restrictions that are directly targeting the number 1 and number 2 deck in V Premium. Because for Luard, we see the following restriction. They made a choice restriction between Skullwitch Nemain, Black Sage Charon, and Dragheart Luard, which means you can only use one of these cards in your deck. And this will significantly limit the power level of Luard, because Charon gave the deck infinite countercharge, and that means the resource engine is severely limited right now, because they had an infinite soul and countercharge engine, but now that their countercharge is limited, that means they cannot just high roll out of nowhere with their infinite counterblast skills, which meant they could just call everything they want, they can multi-tech without any worry, and that meant also that counterblast denying and counterblast choking wasn't an option against the Dragheart Luard deck. Now it is, and that means the opponent can dictate the flow of the battle itself. They can dictate the power level of the Luard player, which in the past they couldn't, because they could just pop off with one counterblast, and that meant if you just gave them one damage in the game, they could do all their skills once they set up. Now that's no longer the game. Now you can limit if they can superior call a bunch of cards, or they can get some value, or they can potentially multi-tag. You can dictate the pace of the game right now, which helps a lot. Now, as for Nemain, I'm a bit confused here, because from my understanding, Luard players were moving away from the main ever since the right line or the superior right engine got limited or restricted or banned. I don't know the exact restriction on the top of my head, but once that was removed from the Luard equation, players were shifting away from the main. Now, I could be wrong, and the players could have gone back with it, because the main is still a free plus engine, and it searched out Abyssal Owl, which is also a plus engine, so I can definitely see the main being a factor within Luard, and with Charon potentially gone, maybe the main could come in its place to just add more advantage, and they preemptively hit the main to just remove that also from Luard, because Luard is making too many pluses in the first place. So honestly, I don't mind this restriction, and it also is a nice way to limit the amount of value that Luard can generate. So either this directly affect decks right now, or this could have affect deck building after this restriction being put into place. So overall, the Luard hit, I'm honestly very excited and happy about, because this definitely will make Luard a lot more fairer, and it now looks to be not like a direct replacement of Chronojet, and now there's actually a place for Chronojet in the current environment. That said, let's take a look at the Bermuda hits, and this is where things are going to get a bit controversial in my opinion. So, for the Bermuda Triangle restrictions, we have the same type of restriction that we saw for Shadow Paladin, because they have a choice restriction with Silver Singer Qtire, Prism Image Rosa, and Mermaid Idol Ellie. So again, you can only use one of these cards per deck. Okay, first off, this destroys the Highlander Prism variant, because Qtire was the backbone of that build, and because you cannot play Qtire with Rosa and with Ellie, which was also a factor for the deck, that means the deck is literally unplayable. Which is good, because the Highlander Prism deck was arguably, or I would say not even arguably anymore, it was the #1 deck in V Premium. Now, some of you out there might think, wait, what is Highlander Prism? Because I am aware that the deck is somewhat flying under the radar here, because the Prism hatred, or the thing with Prism, is mainly talking about pure Prism. The Highlander Prism variant was basically a power crept version of normal Prism, and this deck was taking games left, right, and center whenever this deck was being played on the right, within the right hands, because the deck is kind of nutty the moment you know how to play it. So that deck being gone is great. That means the actual #1 deck is gone. The issue that I have, however, with this restriction is that it does nothing against normal Prism. And normal Prism was the #1 deck in most people's mind. So when people were saying a Prism meta, the Prism is a problematic deck, they weren't talking about Highlander Prism, they were mainly talking about normal, pure Prism. And this restriction with Rose and Ellie not being played in the same deck, in my opinion, doesn't do enough, and maybe almost nothing for the deck to limit its power level. Yes, it loses a bit of shield value. Yes, it loses a bit of on-hit pressure that can allow you to plus in the early game, but that's basically it. The actual plus engine is still there. The actual advantage engine is still there. The multi-tech engine is still there, and the setup is still there. Yes, they don't have a 20k shield in a grade 1. Okay, they lose that card for shield value, but they can just guard with the other 15 cards in their hand. So what actually does this achieve? Now, this does achieve with the fact that they are more susceptible for early aggro decks. Decks that are more explosive right out the gate can capitalize on Ellie being gone, because now it's a bit harder to guard every single card, and they probably need to waste more cards in the early game, or even in the mid to late game, they need to sacrifice more cards from their hand. But that said, with Hamiyo gone, with Luard basically reined in, that means the actual hard-hitting decks that force the Prism player to lose that many cards from their hand, except for the Mirror of course, being somewhat gone, that means losing Ellie already compensate for the fact that Luard and Hamiel are basically gone. Now, that said, there are definitely other contenders out there. Uranus can still blow their entire hand away. Polaris, which is sleeping on a lot of people's mind, is basically a faster and more consistent Uranus in my opinion, is going to be a thing that can definitely blow out the Prism deck. But besides that, it's not a lot of other options, because it either comes down to decks that need to capitalize on a lot of multi-techs to rip through their hand, or decks that can hopefully survive the advantage engine of Prisms. But we all know that the Prism advantage engine is the best advantage engine in the game, and so far it doesn't look to be that any other deck is going to compete with that. So yeah, I'm kind of worried that yes, Luard is gone, or at least not gone, but it's now fair. Hamio's gone, Spectral Duke is reined in, Melody is reined in, but Prisms is still roaming free. Yes, Highlander Prism is gone, but Pure Prism is still basically untouched here. And that is scaring me here. Now, with the whole doom and gloom here out of the way, there is one interesting thing that excites me personally. And I don't know if other players would share this sentiment, but I think a couple will share it. When I look at this bad list, I can only see one thing. And that's Chronojet. Because Chronojet main obstacle were the big explosive decks. Hamiel could basically walk over Chronojet if it went off. Spectral Duke was an annoying face-off for Chronojet. Now its power level is limited. Melody was an insane tough matchup for Chronojet because they could create 50k shield grade freeze against your Sentinel Guard restrict attack. So they could just guard your Vanguard with 2 cards and that's it. You could not win against it. Its consistency being limited is nice. Luard being also more fair is also great for Chronojet because now the deck can actually compete with Luard. The only thing is that Prisms is still at full power. But Ellie being restricted actually works in favor for Chronojet quite a lot. Because with Ellie gone, that means you have less active shield value against the Chronojet guard restricted attack. And usually it was Ellie that made the difference in them being able to guard it or not. So with Ellie gone, that could mean a lot for Chronojet. Now, I'm not saying that Chronojet will be the #1 deck in the format, far from it, but I can definitely see Chronojet making its appearance once again and setting the new stage for V Premium coming out of this restriction list. Now, do I think that this restriction list is enough for V Premium? Personally, I don't think it's enough because Prisms, the pure Prism, is effectively untouched. But with the implication of Luard being more fair, with Gabriel being gone, with Spectral Duke as well as Melody being reigned a little bit, this means that other decks might have the chance to pop up that could compete against Prisms but weren't allowed to compete because these other decks were basically kicking them out of the environment, out of the meta. Because sometimes this happens that there are decks that could outcompete the #1 deck, but they heavily lose against the #2, 3, 4, and 5 spots, and because those decks are still played at a very significant amount of tables, that means those other decks cannot even compete enough to kick out the #1 deck. So there could be a different balance shift here, and with the new V Premium collection coming out, there could actually be a shift here. So we have to wait to see what the results are, and I think this is also the reason why Busho didn't want to go full ham on Prisms, because maybe they are seeing other decks that could outcompete Prisms and we are not. So I think we have to wait and see what the results are going to be for Springfest. And with the fact that ban lists are now going to be every quarter, that means that I think this should be enough for Springfest, and we can wait and see what happens now. And then hopefully we go and see a new ban list that probably will ring in Prisms if Prisms is still running amok within this new format. And that basically sums up the entire ban list and my thoughts about it. Like, it's a mixed bag for me because I'm very excited and happy about the fact that Bushiroad added more restrictions for the English format, which definitely were needed, and they did definitely hit some problematic decks because Luard, Prism, and Highlander were problematic. I just wish that they did something more for pure Prisms in the process, but sadly, it doesn't look to be like that. But I could be wrong here. Maybe Ellie is actually that significant and the loss of Ellie is a detriment for the archetype. We have to wait and see. But with that said, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. What do you think of this new ban list? Are you happy about it? Are you not excited about it? Or do you wish something else were restricted? Or do you think something is too much of a restriction for a specific clan or archetype? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And how excited are you for playing V Premium in the upcoming Springfest with this new ban list? I'm honestly 10 times more excited to play the new environment or the new format, because now at the very least I can play Chronojet without feeling that I'm going to lose my games 9 of 10 times because I didn't high roll enough against the unfair top tier decks. Now I think I can actually win, and I'm definitely going to do so. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!